This is an AASHTO Washington Briefing special report on the Knowledge Session, delivering the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act for a better future, presented by AECOM.
Good morning, everyone, and it's great to be here.
Senior Vice President for AECOM, Shailen Bhatt, planned and moderated this panel discussion. It had only been a few months since President Joe Biden signed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. However, Bhatt was already challenging state DOT leaders to imagine its legacy. The landmark legislation provides $567 billion in Highway Trust Fund and General Fund resources for a 5-year reauthorization of federal highway, highway safety, transit, and rail programs. And as key infrastructure owners and operators, state DOTs will play a leading role in implementing this legislation.
I know when I was the DOT secretary in a couple of states, you always want to have a vision for what this looks like when it ends. Because if you stay down in the weeds of what's being done, you lose sight of the vision of what it's going to look like when you're finished. And so I think that was the idea of bringing together, 4 pretty great leaders to say, hey, take a step back and think about what this looks like 20 years from now, 30 years from now, and what will people say?
Speaking to a packed room of state DOT officials and their private and public sector partners, Bhatt introduced panelist Jim Gray, Secretary of the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet, Diane Gutierrez-Scaccetti, Commissioner of the New Jersey DOT, Roger Millar, Secretary of the Washington State DOT, and Toks Omishakin, Secretary of the California State Transportation Agency. Omishakin focused his remarks on equity.
When you think about this bill and the fact that it has a component called reconnecting communities. It's $1 billion. When the president originally proposed to have an equity component, a dedicated pot of money for equity, the reconnecting communities component was north of $20 billion. Got whittled all the way down to $1 billion. But I believe that it's a deposit into a commitment that all of us in this space can do more. It's an admission to murmurs that have been happening for years about what our infrastructure has done. It's finally a commitment, because for the last 30, 40 years, we've always said, oh yeah, highways have done this, highways have done that. But to put something in legislation and say, we're gonna set aside $1 billion to help with this is truly remarkable.
Secretary Gray said IIJA funding would soon energize an existing broadband improvement program called Kentucky Wired. The new federal funding will mean that people in Kentucky and across the country who don't have access to the internet will soon be able to connect to schools, healthcare, family, friends, and businesses using broadband networks.
Now, shifting over quickly to broadband, Kentucky Wired was actually an 8-year-old project now, but it's really just getting legs. And it's a 3,000-mile open access middle mile network through every Kentucky county. Now we're planning on spending with ARPA funding $300 million and another $200 million IIJA, and then we're planning to leverage another $500 million for broadband development fund.
Commissioner Gutierrez-Scaccetti says that for coastal states like New Jersey, making wise use of the funding identified in the IIJA for resiliency projects is a top priority. NJDOT is developing data-driven tools to help planners choose the best project investments.
And so in New Jersey, with every project that we do, although my engineers are somewhat resistant, they will have to broaden their view of, does this project have a resiliency component? Does it have a component that says it can be a more sustainable project if we just consider these 3 things, and whatever they may be, given the data that we have? Well, when the federal government puts $46 billion in a program for us to address climate change, I feel like that's their message to us, saying it's time. It's time for you to do this. And I'm sure that, as we continue through the planning for the spending of the money, we'll see that even more.
Roger Millar, Secretary of the Washington State DOT, says nearly half of his state's more than 3,300 bridges are rated in poor or fair condition. And while the IIJA will provide a significant boost in bridge funding for states, Millar calls it a down payment.
Our economy doesn't run on the transportation infrastructure we wish we had. It runs on the infrastructure we have today, and we cannot continue to take it for granted. And the bridge program in the IIJA is a wonderful down payment on addressing the issue of state of good repair if we spend the money smart.
I think now what people are able to step back and say is, okay, if we're going to make this generational investment, how do we make it transformational? And how do we ensure that generations to come will say, we did a wise thing with that money?